Ladies and gentlemen, once again welcome to Sophira Fireplace. They say wisdom begins with a question. Apparently, for a long time, Africans forgot to ask them. Also, the colonial textbooks would have us believe. You see, not in fairy tales, but in actual classrooms and academic journals, some folks sincerely believed that indigenous education in the global south was nothing more than superstition wrapped in song, rote memorization around the fire, and elders grumbling about goats and rain. Let's talk about proverbs, those compact little bombs of brilliance. For example, if the lion doesn't tell its story, the hunter will. That's not superstition. That's a whole lecture on historical bias. Another one, wisdom is like a muvule tree. No one individual can embrace it. That is collaborative inquiry before Google Docs existed. Another one, a man who uses his mouth as a spoon will burn it. Translation, think before you speak. Or eat or accuse. These weren't decorative sayings embroidered on dollies. They were logic wrapped in rhythm, ethics disguised as trickster stories, moral inquiry disguised as humor, critical thinking. They asked with colonial brows raised high. Surely not. Africans feel, chant and obey, they don't analyze. And just like that, entire systems of logic, philosophy, and intergenerational knowledge, often embedded in metaphor, story, and oral debate, were dismissed faster than you can say epistemic injustice. But what if indigenous storytellers were philosophers? What if the riddle your grandmother or grandfather told at dusk was a lesson in deductive reasoning? What if the boy who questioned the village chief wasn't being disrespectful but demonstrating, wait for it, critical inquiry? Welcome to Sophira, where we give side eye to colonial myths, roast academic arrogance just a little, and uncover the layered brilliancy of indigenous wisdom traditions. Today's episode is critical thinking in indigenous education. Because Socrates wasn't the only one who asked questions barefoot. Let's get into it. They say wisdom begins with a question. Yet for centuries, many believed that people in the global south, specifically Africans, lacked the capacity for critical thinking, and indigenous education was merely rote memorization, superstition, or emotional-driven tradition. Even prominent thinkers like French philosopher Rousseau went so far as to label African thought pre-logical. In his 1910 book, How Natives Think, he argued that indigenous people, including Africans, could not engage in the rational critical thinking that Western logic demands. Instead, he claimed their minds were ruled by emotion, tradition, and mysticism. But these claims were not the truth. They were born of colonial arrogance and misunderstanding. African indigenous education was never about passive acceptance. It thrived on dialogue, reflection, and moral reasoning. They say wisdom begins with a question. But in many African communities, wisdom starts with a story. So, before we talk about critical thinking in today's schools, let's go back, way back, not to a classroom, but to a clearing in a village. Night has fallen, the air is cool, children gather around the elder, and the fire crackles. Eyes flicker with light and curiosity. The elder's voice breaks the silence. Long ago, in a dry season like no other, when rivers were bones and the soil cracked beneath our feet, Kalulu the hare was thirsty and weak. Clever as he was, some said too smart for his own good, Kalulu stumbled upon a well deep in the bush. Cool water gleamed, but the bucket bore the leopard's scent, a warning, keep away. Just then the leopard appeared. "Kalulu," he said, licking his lips. "You are just in time. I was about to drink, then eat." Kalulu bowed low. "Great leopard, surely your anger is greater than mine, but I know a better feast if you will follow me." Intrigued, the leopard followed Kalulu through the thorn and dust, over hills and termite mounds, until they reached the hunter's camp. "There," whispered Kalulu, "a goat tied to that pole, fatter than me, juicier than bushmeat." The leopard grinned and leapt, but it was a trap. Spears flew, drums sounded, hunters shouted. Kalulu slipped away during the chaos, safe, grinning, and still thirsty. The elder's voice fades, the children lean in, then the questions begin. Was Kalulu smart or selfish? Did he deserve to live at the leopard's expense? What would you have done if you were him? In that moment, ladies and gentlemen, in that moment, the children are no longer passive listeners. They are thinkers, evaluators, philosophers. They argue, defend, and reflect. This is indigenous critical thinking, learning through story, dialogue, and moral inquiry. In the forge, apprentices learned by experimenting and reflecting. Why did the metal crack? What if you hit it longer? Which sound tells you it's ready? That's science. That's ancestral experimentation and reflection. So, how do we bring this rich tradition back into today's classrooms filled with fluorescent lights and bell schedules? Start small. Replace one multiple choice test with a moral debate. Open a lesson with a proverb instead of a definition. Let students tell stories and challenge the characters. Use local knowledge as case studies in science, ethics, and math. Invite elders, artisans, and farmers to explain the why behind their practices, not just the how. Because when we do this, we are not just including culture, we are restoring whole systems of logic, validating local intelligence, and giving students a way of thinking that is grounded, adaptive, and powerful. Critical thinking didn't arrive on a colonial boat or behind a chalkboard. It was always here, sitting under trees, speaking in proverbs, hiding in stories, daring children to question the stars. It's time we reclaim that intellectual heritage, ladies and gentlemen. Time we stopped confusing different with deficient. And maybe, just maybe, it's time the world started quoting our grandmothers and grandfathers alongside their philosophers. After all, as they say in Acholi, the wise one does not say, "I have spoken," but waits for the next question. Thank you for tuning in to Sophira, where indigenous thought gets the mic. If today's episode made you think or laugh, share it, question it, debate it, because that's the whole point. Until next time, remember, the mind grows sharper where stories meet questions. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening.